the book festival. Today we have a conversation, Environment as Character, Writing About Place, and it's a reading and a Q&A. Joining us today we have Chris Latreille. He's a writer, a walker, and a photographer. His freelance writing and photography has appeared in Montana Quarterly, The Drake, The Missoula Independent, The Missoulian, Knives Illustrated, Vintage Guitar, Montana Magazine, Alaska Airlines Beyond Magazine, and World Explorer Magazine. His short fiction has been published in various crime, noir, and pulp collections and anthologies. Anna Maria Spagna is the author of several award-winning nonfiction books, including Reclaimers, Stories of Indigenous Women Reclaiming Sacred Land and Water, 100 Skills You'll Need for the End of the World as We Know It, a humor-infused exploration of how to live more lightly on the planet, the memoir/history Test Ride on the Sunnyland Bus, a daughter's civil rights journey, winner of the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Prize, and 3 essay collections, Potluck, Now Go Home, and most recently, Up Lake, Restless Essays of Coming and Going. Anna Maria's work has been recognized by the Society for Environmental Journalists, the Nautilus Book Awards, the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Awards, and as a 3-time finalist for the Washington State Book Award. Robert Michael Pyle is the author of 17 books, including Chasing Monarchs, Where Bigfoot Walks, and Wintergreen, which won the John Burroughs Medal. A Yale-trained ecologist and a Guggenheim Fellow, he is a full-time writer living in Southwest Washington. Marcia, help me with your last name? Bjornrud, beautiful, is professor of geology and environmental studies at Lawrence University in Appleton. Bjornrud's research focuses on the physics of earthquakes and mountain building, and she combines field-based studies of bedrock geology with quantitative models of rock mechanics. Bjornrud has done research in high Arctic Norway and Canada, as well as mainland Norway, Scotland, New Zealand, and the Lake Superior region. She's the author of a well-received book, Reading the Rocks, the autobiography of the Earth, and a contributing writer to the New Yorker science and technology blog, Elements. So please welcome our guests today.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. We've already established amongst ourselves that we don't really know what we're doing here, but we're going to do it anyway. I was thinking about this, quite a bit. I've played music in rock bands for as long as I've been reasonably adult. So I tend to think of things as it relates to music. So in a lot of ways, this feels like my Iron Maiden moment, because like when we were young and we talked about the bands that as our bands we would want to open for, Iron Maiden was like the one that we wanted to. And as a writer, I've been reading Bob Pyle for, as I told him, our coworkers, last night, as long probably or longer than he's been alive. So for me, as a kind of a opening act to the work these folks have done, and my friend Bob in particular, Bob is Iron Maiden, and I'm just some grubby local street band. And I'm gonna read an essay that's in a collection called Awaken the World, that I have an essay in from the same publisher who published my book. It kind of talks about my non-traditional Montana born and raised upbringing as it relates to wilderness and the wild, because my dad wasn't a hunter. I'm not part of some tradition being handed through generations of going out and procuring wild meat and all that stuff. And there was a time in my life when I probably felt a little inadequate compared to all of my friends who could talk about, because like when I was in high school, out in the parking lot, every third pickup had a gun rack with a rifle in it, all day long at school. And because when school let out, and there were times we would even get out early during hunting season, because everybody was going hunting. And now, one truck shows up with even a gun rack probably, and it's a 4-alarm fire. So it's a totally different environment. So this essay kind of talks about how I came to appreciate being out in wild places that maybe is a little different than some other folks. In the summer of 1977, I was 10. My cousin and I went to the Triplex Theater at the south end of Brook Street, a structure decrepit, for sale, and last used as headquarters for the Republican Party of Missoula, but recently bulldozed to make room for something else, where 3 movies were playing. Viva Knievel, a vehicle for Butte daredevil Evel Knievel to play both action hero and movie star. The Island of Dr. Moreau, from the 1896 sci-fi novel by H.G. Wells starring Michael York and Burt Lancaster, and Star Wars. We paid for one movie, then hopped the fuzzy red velvet rope barriers between auditoriums and watched all 3 in one soda and popcorn-fueled day. It was glorious. Knievel had humbled himself hurtling over the lip of the Snake River Canyon in nearby Idaho a couple years earlier, but he was still a superhero in my eyes, despite my mom's insistence that he was an asshole. I'd thrown myself over my share of makeshift jumps on my bicycle, usually resulting in a tangled wreck of skin, knees, and frustration. Evel seemed cool. His outfits looked like a costume a member of KISS might wear. I was into them too. Star Wars had it all: heroes, a not-so-damsel in distress, laser gunfights, and lightsabers. An iconic character that is essentially a dude in a Sasquatch costume. And finally, possibly the greatest cinematic villain of all time. My mind, and everyone else's it seemed, was blown. Yet as much as I loved Star Wars, it was Dr. Moreau, the evil genius and his transforming man-into-beast experiments, that sparked my fantasies the most. In the aftermath of watching the movie, I roamed the fields and stands of trees near my home with renewed vigor. My 2 dogs, a large white German Shepherd named Sinbad and a Doberman named Jonah, as companions, and a set of plastic vampire fangs clenched between my teeth. In my imagination, I was a half-man, half-wolf hero, the sworn enemy of the diabolical Moreau. Armed with superpowers of strength and agility, my canine companions and I rooted out Moreau's evil plots with abandon for hours at a time. A solitary kid for the most part, I tried to get my recess friends to play Dr. Moreau with me once the school year started up, but they weren't biting, having not seen the movie. I shrugged it off. Playing Star Wars was fine with me too. I am moved to reflect on that summer and summers before and after because of an evening I shared with the writer Terry Tempest Williams. In the first essay of her recent collection, The Hour of Land, a personal topography of America's national parks, she writes of Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming as being her family park, where her people have been visiting for generations. She writes of her intimate connection to wilderness being found there and says, "Our national parks are memory palaces where our personal histories reside." It is a beautiful sentiment and likely true for many people, but it isn't my experience. I found my connection to wildness on the ragged edges of a kind of civilization. It hooked me just as deeply. I grew up in western Montana, lacking any trace of what many tend to think of as a typical Montana upbringing. My father neither hunted nor fished, so I never did either. Neither did my mom. The idea of my dad, who worked 40-plus years of rotating shift work in a paper mill, out hiking is laughable. My mom is an avid hiker, though. To my recollection, that came somewhat later. We never visited Glacier Park or Yellowstone Park, though neither is particularly distant. I only saw the National Bison Range once, and that was part of a school trip, despite driving by it many times on our way to visit my grandparents on Flathead Lake. I recall only one actual camping trip. I spent the night crawling in and out of the camper to go outside and puke because I'd taken ill. I haven't really eaten Fritos much since then either. At the time of my Dr. Moreau experience, my family, besides me, there was my mom, dad, and 2 older sisters, lived in an old farmhouse right in the center of a broad expanse of empty fields and rolling hills. A quarter-mile east of us was a line of trees that ran north to south for a mile or so and was split down the middle by an irrigation ditch. The area is much developed now, but during our time there, we had it mostly to ourselves, with only a couple exceptions, for miles extending up into the northern limb of the Rockies that marked the northern edge of the Missoula Valley. We only had 2 television channels, both fuzzy, so entertainment was generally to be found outside. Domestic animals were always around us. Besides the dogs and a few cats, we had a couple horses, chickens, and several goats. During 4-H season, we raised pigs. Certain times of year, a neighbor grazed his cattle in the fields around us, and walking the half-mile to the bus stop was not an always successful effort in not enraging a mother cow whose calf my sisters and I frightened as we passed. During irrigation season in the summer months, a small lake of subwater would rise in the depression to the northeast of us. It wasn't very deep. At most, it reached my adolescent waist. It got a little swampy too, but that didn't stop me from swimming in it when it grew hot outside. There weren't fish present, but my sister and I would catch tadpoles, then bring them home and put them in an old aquarium to watch them turn into frogs over subsequent days. Frogs and tadpoles were not the limit to the wildlife around us. Sleeping outside in the backyard watching the night sky, pointing out shooting stars and wondering if they were actually Sputnik, we would see bats flitting around catching bugs. They nested in the eaves of our old house. We weren't afraid of them. Badgers den nearby, they made my dad nervous. Gophers, more birds than I can list. Deer, rumored sightings of black bears and mountain lions not far distant. Coyotes were common, making their presence known 2 or 3 at a time by sitting atop a rise just north of the house, as well as their howls in the night. Great hawks would regularly soar overhead, making our dogs charge out into the fields below them, barking and carrying on as if the airspace over the yard was the most inviolable, dearly protected zone under their jurisdiction. Those summer days fading into nights outside didn't always lead to bucolic campouts. These were the 70s. My ear for stories of UFOs and cattle mutilations would make me wake wide-eyed with fear should I hear an airplane or, even worse, a helicopter pass overhead in the darkness. With the 1975 release of Jaws, I was frightened to swim in nearby Frenchtown Pond for fear of death in the deep, though I did it anyway. And I actually still think about that. I go to Frenchtown Pond in the summer, and I think this year it was Meg, about the Megalodon movie that came out this summer. So yeah, I don't swim in it with fear, but I think about it. What if? In the wake of that Predator as villain film, there were a rash of copycats. One was a movie called Grizzly, which I didn't see, whose ads featured copy describing the beast as 18 feet of gut-crunching, mad-eating terror. I asked my dad how tall 18 feet was, and he pointed high up on the side of the house and said, about that high. For nights after, I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the side of the old place, dumbstruck that an animal could be so gigantic, waiting for it to come and drag me away. Books and stories and movies chased me outside to reenact the adventures that drove their respective plots. Then my cousin, the same one I'd seen Star Wars and Dr. Moreau with, introduced me to a new game called Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't long before my friends and I were hooked on the game and its signature brand of role-playing of warriors and thieves and wizards. The hours spent slinging dice and slaying all manner of horrible creatures only drove my sense of wanderlust out in the wilds to greater heights. My high school, which was built in the very center, or very corner of one of the fields where I used to ramble with my 2 big dogs, was easy to escape from, and it was many an afternoon a friend of mine and I would sneak out the back and spend the afternoon roaming the hills with axe handles, left stashed in the woods I knew so well, serving as swords. We weren't hunters, we were adventurers. We weren't pretending to be Jeremiah Johnson or John Coulter or any other famous mountain men. We were Aragorn, the ranger. We were Conan the Barbarian. Tolkien denied it, but many surmise his Lord of the Rings trilogy was an allegory for the world wars, particularly World War I, where Tolkien served in France. Allegory or not, its themes of destruction of the land and simple people resonated with millions, inspired many of the original hippie era Back to the Landers, and certainly reached me. I can draw a direct line of influence from my adolescent reading of Tolkien to the discovery of Thoreau, and from there to the likes of writers such as Ed Abbey, Rachel Carlson, Aldo Leopold, Terry Tempest Williams, and Robert Michael Pyle. I get outdoors whenever I can, and if anything, I'm filled with more wonder than I was as a youth. I'm rarely armed, pretend or otherwise. At most, I'll be carrying a pocket knife, though I suppose I could do some damage if I struck an assailant with either my camera or my binoculars. I have a .30-06 that I take up to the range at behind my home for target practice now and then, and I've even bought elk and deer tags in back-to-back autumns. I've yet to point the rifle at a living thing in the half-decade I've owned it. I was an avid angler for a time, but I've struggled with the ethics of it in recent years, and it's something I continue to wrestle with. I used to feel a little inadequate when I didn't have exciting stories to tell of dragging ungulates out of the woods in the dead of night or landing gigantic river trout. Then again, I've never posed like a grinning idiot next to a dead or dying animal either, so there's that. I'm old enough to have stumbled onto enough wisdom to realize that whatever means I came to enjoy observing the wild world and being out in it is no less relevant than anyone else's. That's the beauty of it. However we get there, we're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We aren't mic'd. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. Thanks to Fact and Fiction, thanks to the Montana Book Festival, thanks to all of you for being here in this lovely space. It's a treat to be here with Chris and Marcia and Iron Maiden, all in one room.
I've got Iron Butterfly before, but never Iron Maiden.
I live in Washington State at the north end of Lake Chelan, a little town called Stehekin. But many years ago, I spent one memorable winter in Missoula with my wife when we were first falling in love, and so Missoula feels like home and is all full of magic to me, so it's a thrill to be back. Our panel was actually called Environment as Character, or something like that. And I really feel strongly that that's what it is in the work that we write. A good character is one that's multidimensional, right? That changes over time, with whom you have a relationship and or conflict. And so my 3 books of essays have all tracked my relationship with Stehekin, with this place that I've lived for 30 years. The first one was arriving and making home and falling in love. The second, Potluck, was joining a community and what does it mean to be in community. And my most recent one, Up Lake, Restless Essays of Coming and Going, is sort of the long relationship and all the sadness and magic and restlessness that comes with having been in a place so very long. And so I thought that this afternoon I would read from an essay called The Tree in the River. It started as a back page essay at High Country News. I often write an essay for them. I know many of you are fans of the magazine. And then I extended it because it was a theme that means a lot to me. I think that it's an essay about resiliency and staying put. Midway, I'll take a break, and you should know that there's an annual ski trip. I worked trail crew for many years, and we would go. We didn't work in winter, but there was one trail bridge that we really believed it would collapse with all the snow that it got in winter if we didn't go once a winter and shovel the bridge. So I did this year after year after year. It was quite a trek in the backcountry. And one year after I had given up trail work, a bunch of my friends went up there on their own. And I think that's all you need to know as I start in with this essay, The Tree in the River. The tree stands in the middle of the river, not in a shallow side channel, but smack in the river middle of the current. Barkless, the trunk battered and discolored like a splotchy ill patient, or worse. Technically the tree is a snag, but still it stands, 100 feet tall or more, with limbs that elbow toward the sky. The tree used to stand on dry ground, of course, a massive ponderosa, orange-barked and majestic, beside a horse trail through the woods. When a major flood came to our valley years ago, the river broadened and chiseled away at the bank, claiming the entire trail and a large chunk of road to boot. We never saw it coming. We should have seen it coming. Floods had wreaked havoc before, but nothing like this. This time, entire swaths of forest dropped into the drink, roots and all. But the tree still stands. We pass by in a car or on bikes or most often on skis. The rerouted road isn't plowed that far, so we cross-country ski past the tree regularly. And every time we do, we stop by the place in the river where it stands to sip water or to peel off a layer, and mostly to marvel, the tree is still there. Sometimes I wonder why we love the tree in the river so much. Is it nostalgia? Do we love it because it's a remnant of the way things used to be? Probably not. If pressed, few of us could remember what exactly it looked like way back when. There are a lot of trees in this valley. I have my favorites, but this was not one of them, until now. Maybe it's because of its hardiness, like a boxer leaning hard against the ropes who will not go down no matter what. Or maybe it's the unlikeliness that it's still there, or that we are, any of us, after 20 years, 25, and counting. Despite the weather, the tourists, jobs held and lost, friends come and go, despite wars, shootings, a black president, a Seahawks Super Bowl, and a sickeningly snowless winter. Who knew you would outlive Michael Jackson and Prince? Own 1 pair of pantyhose, 3 dozen pair of boots, 8 pair of skis, and still ride the same bicycle. Maybe you look at the tree and it's something like a mirror, crooked and bedraggled, but still on its feet. I had skied with my friends up toward the bridge and turned around because we had a sick cat. And I will tell you now that John McCain makes a cameo in this section. At home, after the long ski, I settled in to read John McCain's autobiography. Why this book, I cannot say, but I'd long admired him begrudgingly, this steadfast, scowling survivor. And the cat, never a snuggler, crawled into my lap. And together we sat on the corner of the couch closest to the windows as dusk fell before 5, and then later as moonlight glowed through clouds. There would come a day when I would rethink my admiration for McCain. A day I'd regret leaving the crew alone instead of the cat. But regret is shifty, while memory fixes hard. I remember how tired I was from the long ski up, buzzed from the ski down, settled and hopeful. I could picture the scene in the cabin, skiers slouching, legs outstretched and wet ski boots crossed, elbows table propped, splintery chairs creaky and ever on the edge of shatter, sipping whiskey we'd stashed in a plastic bear-proof canister under tampons and sardines. I could picture the scene the next morning nearly as clearly. The shovels hung high on a cleat on a fur beside the bridge. You'd remove a glove and reach high to loosen the rope and lower the shovels, careful not to let them slide into the creek. Finally, you would step out onto the span, trudge slowly, gingerly to line out. You'd turn the shovel upside down to chop a fault line from which chunks of ice would fall and splash loudly into the water, blue and translucent. Until, all at once, the overhang severs and drops, falling long in the winter sun, and crashes, leaving the bridge quivering, and everyone stone still. So close, so close. They had not, luckily, been standing on the lip. Over and over, I replay that day. The snow fell in a blur, and the guitar on my headphones played reverb slow and low, and my skis moved easily in the tracks up and down, over the creeks, across the bridges, to the falsetto straining, teasing, yearning, the drums thrumming. The next few years would be drenched in grief. Friends died, often unexpected, of cancer, heart attack, plane crash, pneumonia, suicide, and in the wider world, wars escalated, police shot kids, terrorists attacked nightclubs, fires, floods, mudslides, but my friends are still here. Lori is still here. North Fork Bridge still stands. Even McCain, bless his ornery heart, same as he ever was, at least when I was writing it. Only the cat Daisy is gone, replaced by happenstance by one nearly identical. We know someday the tree will topple. We've even considered taking bets on when. But if we had started taking bets back when we started talking about it, by now everyone would have lost. People like to predict when trees will fall. The year after a big wildfire, they tell us, better bring a lot of sawgas. But the roots of the blackened trees took years to loosen, and sometimes never loosened at all. Snags line trails for miles on steep, burned-over slopes. On wind-prone ridges, they stand straight and stubborn. Elsewhere, seemingly healthy trees snapped by the dozen. Trees fell for unexpected reasons, a pestilence in the willows, a freak snowstorm in the spring, or for no reason at all. We gave up trying to guess. But it's a hard habit to break, speculation. We must be hardwired for it. There are books and movies, Station 11, Mad Adam, Mad Max, The Hunger Games, all speculating. Things are bad, and we will either triumph or suffer. The end is caused by a pandemic, flu, or a war, or a natural disaster. The fascination lies in predicting who will survive and how, and for how long. Some people bet on food production, some on weaponry, some on self-reliance, some on cooperation. A few outliers put faith in art. Meanwhile, remnants surround us. The meadow that didn't burn, the sandy ocean bluffs sloughing but not yet slid, the eerie glowing coals in a campfire in the rain, the blackened toenail after a too long hike right before it peels off. Something to cherish, something that can't last. You come around one last bend before the view opens wide. You look up and catch your breath. There it is, still standing, silhouetted white against the cloudless blue. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Anna Maria and Chris, and I look forward to hearing you, Marcia. Chris, kind words. And I got a Davida to you, man. I'm Bob Pyle. I'm so happy to be back here in Missoula and back in Fact and Fiction. Where's Barbara?
She couldn't hear.
Oh, okay. Well, it's nice to see her sitting around doing things other than having to sell books the whole time. It's wonderful to have Mara carrying on the store, and Chris is such an institution. And in the time of the great sixth extinction event, one of the most grievous has been the loss of our independent bookstores. And so when we have a place like this, who knows us, welcomes us in, it's not only a benison and a boon to us all as readers and writers, but it's also a grace note on the entire culture. So let's thank Fact and Fiction for being here. I want to thank the festival, of course, and the organizers. How lovely to be here among the children's animal books. How to Be a Lion, Larnasaurium. I should read those instead. I want to thank Phil Condon, one of the premier environmental writing educators, not only in the country now, but of all time. Phil Condon, thank you so much for having me back here. And Phil Condon is a teacher among us who is responsible for the kind of writing we love here and we're celebrating here today as anybody else in the country. But I also want to thank you, Phil, for having me back to the EWI. I'm teaching the Environmental Writing Institute this week, which I got to do once before in the Teller Refuge, and I did get to teach here as a guest writer for one semester as well. So to be back here is just a joy. But if my voice is a little ragged, it's because the 8 students in my workshop, we're having a vigorous workshop and a lot of fun, and they're here today. And I thank you all students, because this has been one of the most stimulating weeks I've had in a very, very long time. And your readings are adding to it wonderfully. I guess I'm the only one here to read fiction today. I'm reading from a novel called Magdalena Mountain, just published by Counterpoint Press. And I keep being asked here, after 20 books of nonfiction and poetry, why did you write a novel? Well, it didn't exactly go in that order, because I started this novel in 1974. 19? Was it 19? I worked on this novel for 44 frogging years. And 10 drafts. And I guess the 10th time was the charm. So, but this book is all about environment as character. And as I mentioned in our workshop, I like to think equally of character as environment, because that's the most dangerous idea in the world, that the people are not part of the environment. That's why environmental writing and nature writing are complete redundancies. They're just literature. They're just writing that pay a little more attention to the fact that we have other neighbors that are not human, isn't it? And, you know, Bright Lights, Big City and The Return of the Native, these are classic nature books. If you didn't know it, study them and you'll see why. So it's all nature writing, but we do have writing that tends to try to truly exemplify environment as character, and I think that's what I have attempted in this book. I tell the story of 4 people who come to Colorado. Could have been Montana, because the main protagonist lives in Montana too. It's a black butterfly called the Magdalena alpine. It's the only all-black butterfly in the world, and it's a real one. It lives in the rock sides of Colorado, where I fell in love with it the year I turned 12. I've wanted to write about it ever since. But it's the story of the 4 people with the butterfly as a fulcrum to bring them all together, because they all have a different kind of connection to the Magdalena alpine butterfly of different sorts. And so they come to Colorado, and the butterfly, in a way, brings them all together, and stuff happens, as it will in fiction. So I tried to tell the story of the butterfly, a particular butterfly named Erebia, because the name of the species is Erebia magdalena. Alternate short chapters about it and its cohabitants of the high Colorado rock slides, the picas and the marmots, the little boulder bunnies, and the marmots and the others. And those tie into and interdigitate between the human story chapters. So as the human story gathers, we hear about the life of one particular Magdalena alpine and its conifers all the way through as well. And then in the middle of the book, the story of the butterfly and the story of the people merge and interact with one another, and then after the climax, they find their own way home. The name Magdalena is the real name of the butterfly. Why that is something of a word game mystery throughout the book that is made more complex because the name Magdalena I have ramified or proliferated through the Colorado Front Range. So a number of things that aren't actually named Magdalena in the Front Range become that, such as Magdalena Mountain. So I'm going to read the first chapter, which is short, and then a bit from one of the butterfly-based chapters, and then a bit from one of the human-based stories. And I hope you see how they run together. Chapter 1, and I apologize, does anyone know, how many know what a Carmen Ghia is? Wonderful old classic VW sporty car. If any of you have them or had them, I do apologize. I feel very bad about this for a second. It's all because I never got to have one, and I said, if I can't have one, nobody can. 1. The yellow Carmen Ghia left the road at 45. Its tires never scored the soft tissue of the tundra. It simply flew over the edge into the mountain abyss. A lookout marmot shrilled at the sight. A pair of picas, young of the year, disappeared beneath their rock pile as the strange object passed overhead. Clearing the stony incline, the doomed auto glided over the rich mountain turf. Its shadow fell across a patch of alpine forget-me-nots, deepening their hue from sky to delft, and then passed over a pink clump of moss campion. A black butterfly nectaring on the campion twitched in the momentary shading. Such a shift of light often signaled a coming storm, sending the alpine insects into hiding beneath the sod or stones. But this cloud passed quickly, so the sipping butterfly hunkered only briefly and then resumed its suck from the sweet-filled floret. A bigger black form took flight when the bright intruder entered its territory. The raven charged the big yellow bird to chase the interloper out of its airspace, succeeded, and resettled. As the slope fell away toward the canyon below, more than keeping pace with the glide path of the Ghia, so fell the yellow missile. Sky whooshed aside to make room for it. Otherwise, there was no sound but for 3 shrieks on the alpine air. A nutcracker's alarm scream, the whine of the engine, gunned by the foot glued to the Ghia's floorboard, and a third muffled by the glass, growing into a hopeless wail. The thin alpine air parted before the plummeting car, smelling of green musk, of the great high lawn that is the Colorado mountain tundra. The perfumes of 100 alpine wildflowers filled the grill of the Ghia. Soon the sweet mingled scents would be overcome by the rank fumes of oil and gasoline, mixing with the terpenes of the torn evergreen as the grill split against pine and stone. But the rider smelled nothing. The air took on a chill as the projectile left the sunny upper reaches, crossed over timberline, and entered the shade of the upper forest. Never once had it touched down since takeoff, nor could it fly much farther. Gravity never ran out, but the earth rushed up at last to meet it. All the elements of the alpine earth, mineral soil, bare stone, grass, sedge, herb, shrub, and solid trunk of ancient limber pine mingled with the yellow metal when the Gia went to ground. Soft parts met hard, granite tore rubber, branches smashed glass and pierced the cloth upholstery. The engine block escaped its mounts and flew a little farther before shattering against a boulder and coming to rest as shiny shrapnel in the stream bed far below. The blow that tore the motor free, ending its long scream, ripped the driver's door from its hinges. That other shriek was loosed into the general clamor. And then nothing. Almost nothing remained from this unplanned event to disturb the day above where it began. The nutcracker returned to its snag, the marmot to its post, the raven to its rock. The black butterfly nectared on and then flew. The forget-me-nots still flowered low against the ground, and not even the green verge of the road betrayed anything amiss. Only a black rubber streak in the roadway gave away the launching pad. Even the golden-mantled ground squirrel, whose mad dash across the asphalt had started it all, lay not dead on the shoulder, but basking on a boulder nearby in the late summer sun, unabashed by her close call. Of the steaming yellow mass among the trees and rocks 1,000 feet below, no one knew a thing. Bumblebees investigating the yellow spatter on the slope found battered, barren steel instead of woolly sunflowers. The Carmen Gia's aberrant track would never be repeated. And for all the difference it made to the mountain, it might never have happened at all. Now the Magdalena Alpine lives in the high rock slides and it floats up and down the mountain. It floats down, glides down, ball planes down, hang glides down, zip lines down. The males looking for the females amongst the rocks. And then they fly back up again and they do it again until this happens. And from this one, I'm going to segue into the next chapter, which is a human-based chapter. It is good that in animals of poppy seed brains, hormones spring eternal. Never disillusioned, they simply try and try again. Or perhaps it is not so different with humans. Were it not for hope and hormones in whatever mix, many of us would retire to the flower fields too soon, disappointed, as Arabia surely would have done by now had something ineffable and undeniable not driven him back up those rocks once again to sail on down. But there is such a force. So Arabia, showing now more than a hint of brown plush in the right light, flies once again to the knife edge, where he finds an inflorescence of a yellow mustard whose nectar he has never before tasted. Arabia takes off then for his 5th descent of the day. The sun slides past the meridian. If an alpine butterfly can discriminate between cumulus clouds and mountains, as it probably can, Arabia might feel a keener sense of urgency now. The clouds are busy rising in the west, and the day is doomed. Scarcely an hour's worth of courting time remains, and who knows how many more days. Arabia scales a huge boulder and alights briefly on top, surprising the pika in residency, who says, "Geek!" And then he sails off again as the mammal dives for cover. Near the bottom of a boulder, the pink patch of moss campion draws him back down to drink again. But a stronger impulse takes over as a dark smudge enters his broad, short-sighted field of view. He swerves to investigate. The form rises to meet him, and they circle jerkily like paper dolls in a dust devil. It is another Magdalena, but this time a female. She glistens with the iridescence of a newly minted Arabia, shining amethyst and emerald, like a violet green swallow, and her blackness holds the depth of every night there ever was. She's come out of her chrysalis only this morning and scarcely a scale is missing from her wings. His antennae find her perfume on the alpine air, and Erebia smells at last the fragrance he was born to find. Now he senses something entirely new in his experience, as his counterpart's pheromones shiver his ganglia. With a fervor he's never felt in the false flights of earlier encounters, he charges his carbon copy. Unready before, she had already repelled 2 other courtiers today, and now, her wings dry and her own hormones flowing, she too feels a surge of urgency. The pair performs half a dozen pas de deux in an aerial ballet choreographed by centuries of selection, rising a dozen feet above the rocks, close but not touching, exchanging aromas as intensity of purpose grows. The twin black shadows finally drop together among the stones. Male and female circle each other in a dance of recognition. So important. Don't mate with the wrong kind. Don't waste your genes. Don't blow your reason for living in this stony, bony land. Erebia palps the tip of his companion's body with his antennae and receives a strong dose of her special scent. She strokes his forewings with her own antennae, finding the thick patches of androconia, plush velvet pads of sex scales where male satyr's pheromones arise. Now there is no doubt. Magdalena molecules, male and female, flow between them, released by their private dance. No Arctic, no tortoiseshell, no other sort of alpine could make this potion. There will be no mistake. Like a series of locks and keys made smooth and slick with graphite. Like the partners' sexual rhythms flow together as they back end to end on a rock, everting their swollen genitalia. These exquisitely sensitive tissues rub together for a second or two before Erebia's hand-like claspers gape wide and find their way around her endpoint. In a reversal of the common pattern, she enters his body before he can enter hers. And then he closes around her so that, should they be forced to fly in copula, she will be able to carry his passive form without losing hold. Feeling only Pan knows what, Erebia probes his Aediogus into his mate's bursa copulatrix. That might be the most beautiful term in biology. The bursa copulatrix. And then slowly, smoothly, he passes his sperms to her, not in semen, but parceled in a shining envelope. And there the spermatophore will lodge as each egg passing down from her ovaries receives the charge of life from Erebia's seed. The act completed, a kind of gentle subsidence overtakes the lovers, for may they not be called such? From the first encounter through courtship to copulation, only a few minutes have passed. The giving of the spermatophore takes much longer. Even afterward, the mates cleave together, like each other's shadows, like an object in its reflection in a pool of ink, like a Rorschach test for a gentled mind. The two lie bonded, like obsidian chips from an arrowhead's face, like paired punctuation marks inscribed on the tablet of the mountain stone, like black valentines. They repose. Erebia's wings enfolded between those of the larger female, her tip embraced by his body's clasp, such is butterfly love. And so they remain throughout the long mountain night, for a storm arises and sends them understone for shelter, still paired. Chapter 25. The mated pair slid apart as day came and brought a stirring wakefulness. The spent male part shrunk from the female chamber, leaving it vacated but hardly empty, as her musky endpoint slipped from the grip of his claspers. Oberon stretched his long, strong thighs, cramped from enclosing the rounded rump of Mary Glanville for hour after melded hour. She said. Good morning. Thank you very much. Enough of that.
Well, I'm a visitor here. I'm from Wisconsin, and I just want to say I'm just amazed at the literary energy here in Missoula and Montana more broadly, and I just want to echo our gratitude for Fact and Fiction and the organizers of this amazing festival. And I'm a geologist and not a writer by trade. I have a little day job as a professor. But as a geologist, I spend a lot of my time in the past. And my contribution to this meditation on thinking about the environment as character is to get us to think about the environment in the fourth dimension, which is time. So I have a new book out. It's called Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World. The subtitle, frankly, was not my idea. It was published. So you still need to buy Anna Maria's book about surviving the
That was the
apocalypse. So I want us to meditate a little bit about our relationship with time. For children who grow up in wintry climates, few experiences in life will ever elicit the same pure joy as a snow day. School is canceled, the oppressive schedules of the adult world magically suspended. Time itself seems to be repealed in a concession to the greater authority of nature. I vividly recall one particular snow day when I was growing up in rural Wisconsin in the 1970s. There had been a ferocious blizzard the night before with heavy snow and high winds that by morning had brought bitterly low temperatures. But I couldn't resist going out to survey the transformed world. Trees creaked and groaned in the way that they do when it is especially cold. I spotted a dab of red on a branch and saw that it was a cardinal. I started walking toward it in the heavy snow and was surprised when it didn't move. I got closer still and then realized with both revulsion and fascination that it was frozen on the branch. It was as if time itself had been frozen, and I was able to witness something that was normally a blur of motion. Back in the house later the same day, I remember heaving our unwieldy world atlas down off the shelf and paging through it. I came to a map of time zones around the world, with the world divided into mostly longitudinal stripes of alternating pastel colors. But there were several places, Antarctica, outer Mongolia, and a place I'd never heard of, Svalbard in the high Arctic, that were colored gray. The legend said that these places had no official time. I was captivated by the idea of places that had resisted being shackled by measures of time, no minutes or hours, wholly exempt from the tyranny of a schedule. Was time there frozen like the cardinal on a branch, or simply flowing, unmetered, unfettered, according to a wilder natural rhythm? As it happens, I would end up doing my PhD research in Svalbard and spent additional summer field seasons there as a geologist with the Norwegian Polar Institute. I quickly learned that the no official time designation was nothing as romantic as I had imagined, but instead the result of a long-running political spat between the Norwegians and the Russians about whether to use Oslo or Moscow time there. And I began to understand that the place was not timeless, but timeful. When I first arrived there in the 1980s, it still felt like the Pleistocene, the Ice Age. There were whale bones scattered on the tundra, remnants from 17th century Dutch blubber rendering stations. There were 18th century Russian graves from the time of Catherine the Great, when exile to Svalbard was a slow death penalty. There were relics of 19th century miners and hunters, the sinister wreckage of a Luftwaffe plane, and occasionally high up on a mountain peak, the odd weather balloon that had fallen back to Earth sometime in the past few decades. All of these past times seemed equally close, all still palpably present. My own work focused on understanding the tectonic evolution of the northernmost part of the Appalachian Kaleidonide mountain belt, and immersed in this work in a place so remote from modern life, I began to feel that this 400-million-year-old event and the even older rocks recording it were more proximal in time than the 20th century world. In a place like Svalbard that is not covered with human clutter, it is easy to sense the presence of the past, to feel it whispering in our ears. But as a society, we are time-blind, temporally illiterate, chronophobic. We would be shocked if an educated adult had no idea where the continents were on a global map, but don't seem bothered by the fact that few average people have any sense of the geography of the planet's past, the durations of chapters in Earth's history, the timescales of phenomena like climate change and groundwater flow. In communicating with the public, we geologists have perhaps placed too much emphasis on Earth's antiquity and the slowness of geologic processes, but Earth is really not so sluggish. It has many tempos, moods, and modes, and there are unfortunate intrinsic asymmetries in the rates of natural processes. Evolution is slow, but extinction is fast. Planetary cooling is usually gradual, while warming can be abrupt. The French philosopher Bruno Latour has argued that a defining characteristic of modern society is a peculiar propensity for understanding time that passes as if it were abolishing the past behind it. In reality, our modern exile from the past is entirely self-imposed. The past is, in fact, with us. Everywhere, the natural world is bursting with backstories. The world is made of time. We are completely enveloped and inhabited by it. Every cell in our own bodies is an archive of eons of evolution. But does it matter if ordinary people have any sense of geologic time? I believe it does. Stranded on the island of now, we are lonely. We've begun to call ourselves consumers rather than citizens, as if our sole responsibility was to devour everything in sight, like locusts descending on a cornfield. Our insatiable appetite for novelty cuts us off from the very things that might actually nourish us. And most of the environmental problems we face are the result of temporal illiteracy, the failure in the early to mid-20th century to anticipate how new technologies, the internal combustion engine, chemical fertilizers, plastics, antibiotics, would interact over time with complex, evolving natural systems. And time blindness leads to the dangerous illusion that we could shortcut all that slow biogeochemical evolution with silver bullet solutions to climate change, or by terraforming another planet. Such thinking reveals not only a profound ignorance of Earth's history, but also of human history and our capacity to govern and control ourselves. Environmental malefactions and existential malaise are arguably both rooted in a distorted sense of humanity's place in the history of the natural world. To think geologically is not as much about time itself as the power of time to alter, entangle, magnify, and otherwise transmogrify. We need a new relationship with time, a habit of mind that could be called timefulness, an awareness of the rich natural histories in which we are embedded, and a sense that we too live in geologic time on an unbroken continuum from the planet's past into its future. The practice of timefulness could transform our relationships with nature, our fellow humans, and ourselves. Collective awareness of Earth's history might save us from environmental hubris. Understanding how historical happenstance is written into each of our personal lives might cause us to treat each other with more empathy. And a timeful habit of mind might even make us less neurotic about the fact of our own mortality. There's a teaching attributed to the 18th century Polish Hasidic rabbi Simcha Bunim that for me, a very lapsed, indeed deeply agnostic Scandinavian Lutheran, carries great wisdom. It goes, one should carry 2 slips of paper, one in your left pocket reading, "I am ashes and dust," the other in the right saying, "The world was made for me." Both are true. Somewhere between the poles of existential despair and narcissistic self-absorption lies the path that will take us back to the center of the cosmos.
I guess we'll take questions. I'll just kind of moderate that part of the slide. Anybody have any questions?
Or did we impart the sum total of human knowledge?
In a short amount of time.
Some of my students darn well better have the questions.
Anybody? Doesn't even have to be about what we talked about.
I'll just start with a personal comment instead of everybody thinks of their questions. This is from Marcia. I was part of the last class to graduate from Milwaukee Downer College before we merged into Lawrence University. So with that little dusty spider web between us, welcome to Montana.
Thank you for the endowment that you got from the Downer College. We're using it wisely.
Let's hear some thoughts, things on your mind after hearing this.
I just want to know the name of the monk who said, "I am ashes and dust, and the world was made for me."
Simcha Bunim, Simchabunim.
There's a monk in my book too, but he's not as sympathetic as that. So look, you've been looking at books for 3 days and hearing things. You've got something to say, right?
Or an anecdote of your own relationship
Yeah.
to.
Get some conversation going here. Come on. The grades are writing on this, kids.
I just have a comment for Anna Maria. The statement you made about environment as character changing over time, right? And so characters develop and they change over time. I realized I've been working on a memoir for 6 years, and there is a location that it dawns on me is pivotal to the entire work, and it's not just that the location changes over time, but my perception and understanding of it. So it's like, oh yeah, that's a whole.
Fantastic.
This is exciting. So.
Yeah. I sometimes note how I just love that dance of what we think of the place and how the place is changing and how that's constantly evolving. And sometimes people come to a place, like I come to Missoula and it is always 1991 when I come to Missoula, right? Because that's where it is in my heart and it will damn well always be there, right? And so I don't even see the change around it in the way that someone who's been here and has interacted with it for so long. And yet I've changed, right? So part of my dance is thinking, how have I changed since I come? But I love that.
May I say a word to that as well? So true. And you can imagine, having worked on this book since 1974, I almost said 44, I wasn't even born then. But I really got going on it in a big way in 1976, so not quite as long ago. And you can imagine the changes that have taken place in the Colorado Front Range. I was just there last week because I got to give a reading from the book at an old mountain lodge where I not only wrote the book over and over and over, but also where part of the story takes place. So that was a dream come true. But that particular place is remarkably like it was in 1976. This little pocket of the Peak to Peak Highway. Meeker Park Lodge, which becomes Magdalena Park, and Mount Meeker, which becomes Magdalena Park. But that's because of Rocky Mountain National Park and because that particular place has been spared fire so far and so on. And yet the setting of the entire book, which ranges from Yale to the Washington coast to New Mexico, but mostly in Colorado, the places and the people and everything have changed so very much. So as this book's evolving, decade after decade, do I get everything up to date? Do I try to make it fit the current reality, which will be different by the time it's published, et cetera, et cetera. So I took a leaf from your book without knowing what you were going to say. And I set the thing in 1974, and that's the way it is. But you wrote about time. You must have something to say about this.
Again, there are many. I had a math professor who used to say there are many sizes and shapes of infinity. And I think that's a useful way to think about geologic time. There are things that are a long time ago, a long time ago, and getting some depth of field is the key.
Good term. That was good. Good luck with your memoir.
Yeah.
Bruce.
I have a question, I think it relates to that issue of time, but any of you could respond to this. The controversy about the Anthropocene. How should we look at where we stand and how important we are in the long course of time?
I mean, so I'm sure most people know this idea of the Anthropocene is at some point in the last perhaps century or less, we've crossed a threshold where humans are just as important as geologic agents as any natural processes. And that idea is very much in currency in the popular imagination and is being used scientifically informally. The only controversy, I think, is it's kind of bureaucratic, is when exactly to define that and how. But I think most geologists are already accepting this idea. It's just how do we have a particular layer of ice, or how do we formally define the start? Is the one discipline.
But there is a problem with the whole construct. I minored in geology, and I love geology dearly, especially geomorphology. And I could almost remember the names of the eras and the ages. Don't test me. but most of them had definitions that had to do with either major disconformities in the land or with major extinction events and so on and so forth. This one has a lot of common with that, and it rightfully recognizes the extreme impact of one particular species upon the environment that it shares with all the other species. But there's also, it seems to me, something doesn't sit right in my craw with it, because there's something of extraordinary hubris in naming a geologic era after ourselves. Let's talk about us for a few thousand years. And so practically speaking, and in terms of ecological impact, I completely see the point. But obviously I'm not very happy about the conditions it would lead to. I'm not entirely happy with it etymologically either, philosophically, and I'm not sure how else. It makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I just want to, I totally acknowledge it too, for a lot of good reasons, but I too feel it's very much a double-edged sword in the hands and the minds of some people. It can go in a whole different direction, as can the whole notion that to try to break down the artificial divide between humans and nature, which I also agree with. But I have had students, I have discussions where, oh, so everything's natural. And, well, then everything we're doing is natural. And on one level that may be true, but it just, to me, there's always these double-edged sword when you, and it's just important to keep that in mind.
It is, Philip, but the fatal flaw with that reasoning, which is a very common response to that, and I'll say this, it's extraordinarily difficult logically to name something that doesn't belong to the physical natural world, right? We're an upright species of hominoid apes, so of course all of our artifice is part of nature and the environment. But that doesn't make it okay. And I think the problem is that a lot of people equate the word natural with the word good. And look how the marketers have exploited that.
Aristotle did.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, and so with that's right. So with the Anthropocene, I worry too about the acceptance of it, and then a certain large number of people who are already pretty happy with becoming, what's the word when you become completely technologically dependent and all your devices are all plugged into you all at the same time? There's a word for that.
Cyborg?
Cyborg, yeah. Thank you. It's a word that would be rare in Missoula. But people who are quite happy with the idea of us becoming more and more of a cyber species could hear this word, the Anthropocene. Oh, okay, it's ours. Now we really can do what we want.
I'm just glad, because I didn't know how to pronounce it until we started talking about it.
Oh, we pronounce it 3 ways.
I wouldn't stop.
Just for fun, about 2.5 months ago, I was out on Sweeney Creek, hiking up Sweeney Creek, and I'm starting to get some problems with height. So I was out there just putting some culture into that part of my daily work. So I looked down and to my left and saw a kind of a semicircular shiny object at distance. And I stopped and looked and tried to figure out what it was, and realized it was the rear view mirror of like a 54 Mercury. Looking back up the slope of things. And now I can probably use that.
Great thing about what you said just there, I mean, it's a marvelous experience. I hope all of the writers I'm working with this week noted the specificity with which you took great notice of detail. I like to say the plumage of a magpie distills the purple from this, the blue from that, or the green from that, violet green swallow, whatever, and the blue from a 54 Chevy.
You can have that part of it.
I would love to ask how, and anyone can feel free to answer this, how do you recommend cultivating a practice of timefulness?
timefulness, not mindfulness, but timefulness.
As Marcia shared.
Yes.
Yeah.
New agey.
Right.
Take some geology. But learn, that their backstories bursting out at us all over. Right here in Missoula, I can't help but feel the presence of glacial Lake Missoula. Right because then underneath it, you can see the wave wash terraces so obviously up on the hills. Every place has its backstories, and there's so much good natural history writing.
And I so appreciate that perspective, because sometimes I think we use the word mindfulness to mean now. And what was your wonderful line? Stranded on the island of now, where we are lonely.
And actually, the Buddhist concept of sati or mindfulness actually means something closer to the memory of the present.
Wow.
Which is, I think, a much more subtle relationship with time. We have this very naive, sort of linear relationship with time, and what I'm arguing for is we live in many different
Nice. Good try.
This is kind of a general question that we can answer, but I feel like oftentimes when you're talking about environmental writing or fiction where the environment is a very large part of it, there's a lot of personification that occurs of things that are not human, and there's some people who are fine with that, and some people are like, oh, we can't do that. We can't prescribe human qualities to these natural things. I don't know, I guess, how do you feel about that? Do you try to avoid that in your writing? Do you embrace that in your writing?
So the question is about personification and whether that's okay when you're writing about non-human entities.
Well, I can take that since I've done that. I've studied it for a long time too. The literature of the fiction of humans and other species mingling in a fictional narrative. Recently, Brian Doyle, wonderful writer whom many of you will know, and we lost him way too early recently, but he won the John Burroughs Medal for Distinguished Nature Writing for his book Martin, Martin. Only the second time a novel ever had. The first one was the marine biologist Victor Sheffer for his novel called The Year of the Whale. He also wrote The Year of the Seal. In both cases, they relied a lot on personification, as did one of the great classics of literature. Let me just say that. Tarka the Otter, which was made into a fairly forgettable cartoon later, but the book by Henry Williamson, stunning book. If you ever want to know how you can follow 30 yards of stream bed in 30 pages of beautiful text, read that, and then you're going with the otter, Tarka. Well, Tarka is personified. But that's different from placing your narrative in the paws of your creature and trying to inhabit its mind to draw the life that might really be lived by it in human words so that other humans can read it. That's a form of personification, and that's what I try to do in Magdalena Mountain. The Alpine has an adventurous life, and the people have one too, which ends up with menace and excitement and so on. But I can make all that up. I kind of know how people work a little bit, I can imagine that. With the animal, I wasn't about to make up any biology that it did. So I'm trying to keep it true to its biology and yet apply my lyric perception to it. That's the kind of personification that I think we not only may do but must do to some degree or other. And Watership Down now, you see, of course, goes another whole step farther, or Thornton Burgess's bedtime stories, or Wind in the Willows, because they add speech and clothing and so on. That's anthropomorphism at that level. But if they didn't, they wouldn't have the readers that they have. And not only that, but Thornton Burgess and Wind in the Willows is by Graham, and of course Watership Down by Richard Adams. They all do homage to the actual natural history of the animals they're writing about. So I say, go for it, but just be attentive to the real facts of the real physical world.
I think some of that, the attitude that you shouldn't do that kind of relates to what Bob was talking about as far as our arrogance too, the idea that only humans have the capacity to feel and love and suffer pain and struggles. You know, there's a lot of science, like Carl Safina wrote the book Beyond Words, and he talks about, up until just the 90s, it was almost career suicide for scientists to suggest that animals could feel. And then he, which is a great book, he breaks it down between elephants, wolves, and killer whales, and just the way that they communicate. and the way they live as a community of communication, not just within their own species, but with the world around them. So I think that people that, you know, like you mentioned, that think that there's a problem with that are going to be on the wrong side of the future history that we're creating in how we relate to animals and even plants, you know.
And rocks.
Kimmerer,
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer talking
Yeah,
about
right.
plants, you know. So, yeah.
Or David Haskell, fine scientist from the Southeast, who won the Burroughs Medal this past year in the Songs of the Trees. Doesn't quite personify it as much as that, but he certainly respects the individuality and traits of these plants that he writes about, these trees that he writes about, as entities. He doesn't necessarily go all Lockwood and give them, you know, feedings and so on and so forth, though who knows. But he's a scientist, highly respected, and he goes that far. So I think that's becoming passé, as you say. I love that, Chris. We're on the right side of history.
That's right.
Well, and of course, in science, I mean, it's anathema if you're a biologist to anthropomorphize nature, but it's a completely wrong-headed thing because we're on a complete evolutionary continuum with everything in nature. So of course we see ourselves in everything because we emerge from the same substrate.
Yeah,
Do you
right.
face some of that same prohibition in the
Pushback,
work
yeah,
that you're doing?
I think so.
here?
Even though I think that most geologists sort of secretly have a kind of relationship with the rocks that they study, maybe unrequited love or some kind. But
Well, like an indigenous culture too.
Certainly.
You know, like that's another thing that Robin Kimmerer talks about is scientists kind of turning their nose up for decades on indigenous cultures' knowledge of the parts of the world that were considered inanimate, which to them are animate. And what she does is do this great melding of science and indigenous knowledge. You know, the indigenous knowledge goes way back a lot farther than the science does. And you know, similar to the animal question, I think people are starting to recognize that as being a little bit more valid than maybe we did even 20 years ago.
absolutely. I mean, there's this emerging field of biogeochemistry where the inorganic substrate is intimately engaged with the biological.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but your idea of continuum is so important to all of this. Play did not arise with us. Just watch the otters in the Clark Fork, and you know that.
Carolyn.
I just wanted to know if any of you, as people who clearly believe in the continuum of all life, geological, biological, botanical, human, do you get any pushback from those who may live in the woods but believe that everything is only about 5,000 years old?
Oh yeah, I mean
Yes, and how do you reply?
I've lived for 40 years in a rural area that has a lot of conservative church attendance, sweet people who might be and have been the EMTs coming on emergency calls at my house and others. You know, these are neighbors. They're different creation myths. They're different perceptions of time, place, and origin. It doesn't hurt me. You know, it bothers me if it comes into the schools as curriculum, and it has, and I've been drafted to go into the schools and do a little antidote. But I start out by saying that this doesn't in any way challenge your particular faith or your creation myth. Let me tell you about another creation myth that you probably want to know about if you're going to go out into college. Yeah, that's always there, but I don't think it's one of the larger problems until it comes to a policy point, farther up the line.
Or it's being defended at the end of a Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's what I mean, right.
Can I say something about that? I do occasionally have students who really are struggling with reconciling religious upbringings and beliefs they grew up with geological deep time. And I have a couple of responses. I mean, if they really are struggling, I pose this question to them that they have to answer themselves. It's kind of variation on Descartes' argument about the nature of reality from Meditations, which is more heretical to you. The idea that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and was set in motion by a creator and it's evolved in all kinds of complex ways. Okay, that's one option. Or a deceitful creator that has planted every evidence of a 4.5 billion in every single fossil bed, in every zircon crystal we might pick up to date.
That's very good. But, you know, it's just not helpful to actually debate or try to convince it.
Until it enters the policy arena, then then I start digging in my heels and say, okay, then you can live with that worldview, but no fossil fuels for you. modern medicine,
That's
because
good.
that's an evolution, you know, why would we believe any experiments on mice if we didn't think we were related to them evolutionarily?
Right.
That's where I get a little.
Oh, yeah.
And just to turn it inside out, not at all on the time continuum, but one thing that I have learned to have deep respect for those neighbors is that a lot of my neighbors who have those beliefs have stayed in the same place for a long, long, long time, and they do have deep knowledge of how things work, and they have taught me a sense of wonder for details in the way that particular place functions that has been has certainly informed my larger sense of, oh, it's all part of a big thing. Yes, but there's also this that's right here that's very small and has nothing to do with the policy debate, but I've taken some humility in building relationships with people. on
That's
that level.
so important. And so when the young witnesses come to my house, I invite them onto the porch, and we'll have something non-alcoholic and non-caffeinated to drink, and we'll talk. But we won't debate. I certainly won't debate or try to convince them of anything. But I will try to let them know about my motivating myths and the world as I see it and so on, but not in an argumentative way, because their faith means something to them. It's precious to them. Why would I want to take that away from them? Until, of course, it begins to affect other populations. Proselytism and evangelism are a very different subject from belief. You got your hand up, Mason?
Yeah, I've got a question. So talking about this idea, your idea of timefulness, you know, like right now, whenever we're talking about the pollution we're putting out, I think that it's a lot harder to think about something like a couple million years. For example, the depleted uranium we put into the deserts of Iraq will be around probably until the sun goes out. And so when we're talking about this idea in terms of the pollution and the effects that we're having on the planet, how do we, you know, generate this sort of timefulness as it relates to these things we're putting into the environment that will be there, to something that we can't even really visualize?
I think it's not the million-year time scale we need to worry about, it's sort of the decade to century, and it seems more than ever in our culture and in our political realm, we don't have mechanisms for planning even on a 2-year cycle. The congressional election cycle really drives politics now. In the corporate world, quarterly reports have to be good time and again. And so the decision-making window is getting shorter. At the same time, we need people with a longer view. And sadly, really some of the only organizations that can make decisions over the long haul are super wealthy people who have foundations, who are doing good work, but that's a highly undemocratic way to govern the future. We need to reclaim, redemocratize the future. And it's really the decade to century time scale that we need to start figuring out ways that we can something.
And yes, and perhaps it's not likely that will happen. In which case, yeah, I'd like to think it might be too, but when asked to contribute an essay to a book of climate change responses by Kathleen Moore, and I felt I had nothing to add to that. But she insisted, so I said, can I write just what I want to write? And he won't like it. She said, it's okay, everybody's being too damn polite in this book. So I wrote a cheery little essay called Evening Falls on the Maladaptive Ape, which has an even cheerier final line, which is, evolution will mock our tardy rage. And I don't necessarily believe that darkly all the time. In fact, I'm a stupid optimist in the short term. But I do think it's very necessary to recognize also that while the opportunity, if any meaningful change is going to happen, it's got to be in the tens and probably not even the hundreds. But if that doesn't occur, and there's pretty bad odds with the population trends, not to mention the ongoing obeisance to economic growth in almost every culture, then you start looking at the hundreds of years. And that's where cultures of local devotion to the land, which is going to include the conservative Christian truck farmers across the valley from me, as well as the logger down the road, as well as the hippie conservation writer in my house, may survive in those kinds of places. Places like this where you have the great tradition of local food and devotion to land, which comes largely out of your shop, and then you get the fragments and the remnants. And that's why we still do nature conservation, in my view, to protect the biggest body of genetic base for the next iteration, the next evolutionary iteration, the next cultural iteration. And I frankly think that might be more likely than making things okay this time around. But that's a dark view, and I apologize for that.
Well, and some of the answers are simple. I mean, like, don't do nuclear anymore. That's a simple way to not have to worry about nuclear waste, you know. Or I read a guy writing an essay about, you know, the proliferation of plastic straws in the ocean, and everybody was raving about some company who designed some new straw that's biodegradable. It's like, no, let's just not use straws at all. You know, I mean, you don't solve the problem of one product by creating a new product, because the creation of that product just is going to generate a whole nother, you know, endless cycle of things that down the road we're going to go, we sure were stupid to make these biodegradable straws with this machine that has a half-life of 50 billion years, you know. I don't know. I mean, it's so many of the answers are so simple, but it's so hard to be simple.
Well put. One of the most important things, though, is to keep writing and reading the literature that embraces all of the land and all of the creatures. That's got to be one way to preserve not only an adaptable outlook, but also one that well, Scutch. Whose essay did Scutch come in? Did Bruce. The other day, Bruce had an essay, wonderful essay about in which Alexander von Humboldt came up. But also, wasn't his name Alexander too, Scutch? Yeah, Alexander Scutch, the great, more contemporary Yankee biologist down in Costa Rica. And Scutch concluded one of his books in which he said, everything I do, everything I write, is to help preserve caring and cherishing minds. He said the caring and cherishing mind is the world's best hope. That's what we're doing here. All of us.
Thank you
so
for
much.
coming.
We're going to go vandalize books so they won't have any more future value. Support fact and fiction.